The mountain was collapsing and there was nowhere to run. Tobias McKenzie heard the rumbling deep in the earth beneath his feet, felt the tremor that every experienced miner knows means death is coming fast. But at 52 years old, with a left leg mangled in a cave-in 3 years earlier, Tobias couldn't run even if he wanted to. He could barely walk the 100 yards from his isolated cabin to the abandoned silver mine where he still searched for enough ore to buy beans and coffee. What he didn't know was that in the next 60 seconds his inability to run would save a life, change the course of 2 cultures, and prove that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who have no choice but to stand their ground when everyone else flees. But to understand why this moment would transform a broken-down cripple into a legend honored by both white settlers and Lakota warriors, you need to know about the choice Tobias made 4 years earlier when the same mountain took everything he had ever worked for and left him with nothing but a twisted leg and a stubborn refusal to give up. Because this story begins not with heroism but with a man's decision to keep digging when everyone else said the mountain had already beaten him. It was September 12, 1878, in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, when the first cave-in destroyed the McKenzie family silver mine and changed Tobias's life forever. The mine had been his father's dream, carved into the mountainside with nothing but hand tools, black powder, and 30 years of back-breaking labor. When his father died in 1875, Tobias inherited not just the mine but the obsession that came with it. The absolute certainty that somewhere in those dark tunnels lay enough silver to make the McKenzie name mean something. Tobias had been working alone that day, as he did most days since his 2 brothers had given up and moved to California. The silver vein had been playing tricks on him for months, appearing and disappearing like a mirage, leading him deeper into the mountain than any sensible man would go. But Tobias wasn't sensible anymore. He was desperate. The mine was all he had left, the only thing standing between him and the admission that 30 years of his family's life had been wasted chasing shadows in the dark. The cave-in happened without warning. One moment Tobias was swinging his pickaxe at a promising vein of ore, and the next moment the world was falling down around him. Tons of rock and timber crashed down, trapping his left leg under a massive boulder and sealing him in a pocket of space barely large enough for a man to lie down. In the complete darkness, listening to the mountain settle around him, Tobias thought he was going to die. For 18 hours, Tobias lay trapped in that tomb of stone, his leg crushed and bleeding, his water gone, his hope fading with each passing hour. But somehow, through a miracle he never fully understood, a pocket of air had formed above him, and water was seeping through the rocks just fast enough to keep him alive. When the rescue team finally reached him, led by neighbors who had heard the explosion from 5 miles away, they found a man who should have been dead, but was somehow still breathing. The doctors in Deadwood saved Tobias's life, but they couldn't save his leg. The bones had been shattered in too many places, the muscles too badly damaged. When he finally walked again, it was with a pronounced limp and a constant pain that would never fully go away. More devastating than the physical injury was the realization that his mining days were over. No mining company would hire a crippled man, and he couldn't work his own claim with only one good leg. Most men would have given up then, sold what was left of the mine for whatever they could get, and found some other way to make a living. But Tobias McKenzie was not most men. The mountain had taken his leg, his livelihood and his future, but it hadn't taken his stubborn Scottish pride or his unshakable belief that the silver was still there, waiting for him to find it. Against all advice and common sense, Tobias rebuilt his life around the damaged mine. He constructed a small cabin near the entrance, designed with ramps and handholds to accommodate his disability. He learned to use lighter tools and work shorter shifts, taking frequent breaks to rest his leg and manage the pain. Progress was slow and frustrating, but Tobias kept digging, convinced that perseverance would eventually triumph over adversity. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Tobias's cabin was 15 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through the mountains. Visitors were rare, supplies had to be hauled in by mule, and the long winter months passed in almost complete solitude. But solitude also brought a kind of peace. Away from the pitying looks and whispered conversations of townspeople, Tobias could focus on his work without being constantly reminded of what he had lost. Over the years, Tobias developed an almost mystical understanding of the mountain. He could read the rocks like other men read books, sensing where the silver might be hiding, feeling the mountain's moods and temperaments. He learned which tunnels were stable and which were dangerous, where water was likely to seep in, and how to shore up weak areas with timber and stone. It was dangerous work for any man, doubly so for someone with a bad leg, but Tobias had made his peace with the risk. The mine gradually became more than just a job or even an obsession. It became Tobias's identity, his purpose, his reason for getting up each morning, despite the pain and the loneliness and the growing certainty that he might never find enough silver to justify the years of struggle. He was no longer Tobias McKenzie the miner. He was Tobias McKenzie, the man who refused to quit, the stubborn fool who kept digging when everyone else had given up. By the summer of 1882, Tobias had been working the damaged mine for 4 years without finding anything more than trace amounts of silver. His savings were nearly gone, his body was wearing out from the constant strain, and even his legendary stubbornness was beginning to waver. He had reached the point where he was working more from habit than hope, going through the motions of mining without really believing he would ever strike it rich. That's when Standing Bear entered his life, though Tobias didn't know the young Lakota's name at first. Standing Bear was the 14-year-old son of Chief Red Hawk, one of the most respected leaders of the Lakota nation. Unlike many of his people, who viewed the white man's presence in the Black Hills as a violation of sacred ground, Standing Bear was curious about the strange activities he observed during his hunting trips through the mountains. Standing Bear had been watching Tobias for weeks, fascinated by the white man's daily routine. Every morning, the limping figure would emerge from his cabin and disappear into the dark hole in the mountainside. Every evening, he would come out covered in dust and rock chips, moving slowly and painfully back to his cabin. The young Lakota couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily enter the dangerous interior of the mountain, especially someone who was clearly injured and struggling. Lakota tradition taught that the Black Hills were sacred, the home of spirits and the source of powerful medicine. To dig into the mountain seemed not just foolish but blasphemous, a violation of the natural order that was bound to bring misfortune. Yet there was something about the white man's determination that Standing Bear found admirable, even if he couldn't understand the motivation behind it. On the morning of September 20th, 1882, Standing Bear's curiosity finally overcame his caution. He had been tracking a wounded elk through the area when he heard sounds coming from inside the mountain, not the usual rhythmic pounding of Tobias's pickaxe, but something different. Shouting, panic, the unmistakable sound of falling rock. Standing Bear approached the mine entrance cautiously, unsure what he might find. The opening was partially blocked by fallen stones and dust was still settling in the air. From somewhere deep inside the mountain came a voice calling for help, but it wasn't the white man's voice he had expected. It was younger, higher-pitched, speaking in Lakota. In his eagerness to explore the mysterious tunnels, Standing Bear had entered the mine without understanding its dangers. The timber supports that Tobias had carefully installed over the years were old and stressed, barely adequate to hold back the weight of the mountain. Standing Bear's movement through the tunnels had disturbed the delicate balance, triggering a cave-in that trapped him in a chamber roughly 50 feet from the entrance. When Tobias heard the commotion outside his cabin, his first thought was that claim jumpers had finally found his mine. He grabbed his shotgun and hobbled toward the entrance as quickly as his damaged leg would allow. What he found instead was evidence of a cave-in much smaller than the one that had nearly killed him 4 years earlier, but potentially just as deadly for whoever was trapped inside. The voice calling from within the mountain was clearly that of a young person, and clearly in distress. Tobias faced a terrible dilemma. Attempting a rescue would require him to enter an unstable area of the mine, risking another cave-in that could kill both him and whoever was trapped. His bad leg would make the work slower and more dangerous, and he had no one to help him if something went wrong. But Tobias McKenzie had spent 4 years learning to overcome obstacles that would have stopped most men. He had rebuilt his life around the principle that determination could triumph over any adversity, that refusing to quit was sometimes the only victory possible. He couldn't walk away from someone who needed help, even if that someone might be a claim jumper or worse. Tobias gathered his mining tools and entered the damaged tunnel, moving as quickly as his leg would allow. The cave-in had created a maze of fallen rocks and twisted timber, but Tobias's experience told him that the trapped person was probably in the chamber where he had been working on a promising silver vein. The irony wasn't lost on him that his years of fruitless digging might finally serve a purpose, even if it wasn't the purpose he had intended. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each rock had to be moved carefully to avoid triggering another collapse, and Tobias's injured leg made the work twice as difficult as it should have been. Every few minutes, he called out to let the trapped person know that help was coming, receiving increasingly weak responses that told him time was running out. As Tobias worked his way deeper into the damaged tunnel, he began to understand the full scope of the challenge. The cave-in hadn't just blocked the passage, it had destabilized the entire area. Every movement risked bringing down more rocks, and the timber supports were groaning under stresses they hadn't been designed to handle. A younger, more agile man might have been able to work quickly enough to complete the rescue before the situation became critical. Tobias would have to be more careful, more methodical, and hope that careful was also fast enough. When Tobias finally reached the trapped person, he was amazed to discover a young Lakota boy, barely into his teens, wedged under a fallen beam but miraculously not seriously injured. The boy's eyes went wide with fear when he saw the white man approaching, but Tobias immediately set about freeing him without asking questions or demanding explanations. The rescue took another hour of careful work, with Tobias using his years of mining experience to safely remove the debris that had pinned Standing Bear. Throughout the process, the older man kept up a constant stream of reassuring conversation, even though the boy clearly didn't understand English. When Standing Bear was finally free, Tobias helped him make his way back through the damaged tunnel to safety, both of them moving slowly and carefully to avoid triggering another collapse. Outside the mine, in the clear mountain air, Tobias got his first good look at the person he had rescued. Standing Bear was clearly Lakota, dressed in traditional clothing, and carrying a bow that marked him as a hunter. He was also clearly terrified, probably expecting to be shot or captured by the white man who had saved his life. Instead, Tobias offered him water and food, gesturing for him to sit down and rest while he examined the boy for injuries. Standing Bear had some cuts and bruises but nothing serious. What concerned Tobias more was the boy's obvious fear and the realization that his presence here might indicate larger problems. Lone Lakota hunters in the Black Hills usually meant that there were more Lakota nearby, and the relationship between the tribes and white settlers had been tense for years. Using a combination of hand gestures and simple words, Tobias managed to communicate that Standing Bear was safe and free to leave. He made no attempt to detain the boy or demand explanations for his presence. As far as Tobias was concerned, someone had needed help and he had provided it. The boy's identity or tribal affiliation didn't change that basic fact. Standing Bear, for his part, was overwhelmed by the white man's kindness. Everything he had been taught about white settlers suggested that they were violent and treacherous, interested only in taking Lakota land and destroying Lakota culture. Yet this man had risked his own life to save a Lakota boy he had never met, asking for nothing in return except the knowledge that he had done the right thing. Before leaving, Standing Bear tried to express his gratitude in the only way he knew how. He removed a small medicine pouch from around his neck, a sacred object that had been blessed by the tribe's medicine man, and offered it to Tobias. The white man clearly didn't understand the significance of the gift, but he accepted it graciously and tied it around his own neck, where it would remain for the rest of his life. As Standing Bear disappeared into the forest, Tobias returned to his cabin to tend his own injuries and assess the damage to his mine. The cave-in had destroyed weeks of work and made several tunnels too dangerous to enter. But for the first time in years, Tobias felt like he had accomplished something meaningful. He had saved a life, and in doing so, he had rediscovered a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with finding silver. What Tobias didn't know was that Standing Bear ran all the way back to his father's camp, a journey of nearly 20 miles, to tell Chief Red Hawk about the extraordinary white man who had risked everything to save a Lakota boy. Standing Bear's account was so detailed and emotional that Red Hawk initially suspected his son might be suffering from injuries that affected his judgment. But Standing Bear insisted that every word was true. The white man had been alone, crippled and vulnerable, yet he had entered a dangerous mine to rescue someone he had never met. He had treated Standing Bear with kindness and respect, given him food and water, and asked for nothing in return. Most remarkably, he had accepted the sacred medicine pouch with the reverence of someone who understood its spiritual significance. Chief Red Hawk was a wise and experienced leader who understood that individual actions could sometimes bridge even the deepest cultural divides. If Standing Bear's account was accurate, this white man had demonstrated the kind of courage and compassion that the Lakota valued above all other virtues. Such behavior demanded recognition, and more importantly, reciprocation. For 3 days, Chief Red Hawk consulted with the tribal elders and medicine men, discussing the proper response to this unprecedented situation. Some argued that one good deed by one white man didn't change the larger pattern of broken treaties and stolen land. Others suggested that acknowledging the rescue might be seen as weakness or an acceptance of white presence in the sacred Black Hills. But Red Hawk had lived long enough to know that wisdom sometimes required setting aside old grievances in favor of new possibilities. The white man had honored Lakota values without knowing he was doing so, treating Standing Bear as a human being worthy of help rather than as an enemy to be feared or despised. Such behavior deserved to be honored according to Lakota tradition, regardless of the political complications it might create. On the morning of September 24th, 4 days after the rescue, Tobias McKenzie woke to the sound of horses outside his cabin. He assumed it was probably traders or prospectors passing through the area, though visitors were rare this far into the mountains. When he opened his door to investigate, he found himself facing a sight that would have terrified most white men: nearly 500 Lakota warriors, mounted and armed, arranged in a vast semicircle around his property. At the center of the formation sat Chief Red Hawk, an imposing figure whose decorated war bonnet and elaborate clothing marked him as a leader of great importance. Beside him sat Standing Bear, the boy Tobias had rescued from the mine, now dressed in his finest ceremonial garments. The entire scene had the formal, ritualistic quality of a significant tribal ceremony. Tobias's first instinct was to reach for his shotgun, but something in the warrior's posture told him this wasn't an attack. They sat quietly on their horses, weapons visible but not raised, waiting for something. The boy he had rescued was clearly unharmed, and appeared to be there voluntarily. Whatever was happening, it wasn't what Tobias would have expected from 500 hostile warriors. Chief Red Hawk dismounted and walked slowly toward Tobias's cabin, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. Behind him came Standing Bear and several other tribal members carrying what appeared to be gifts. Tobias stood in his doorway, leaning heavily on his walking stick, unsure what protocol might apply to this extraordinary situation. When Red Hawk was close enough to speak, he began a formal address in Lakota, his words carrying the weight of ancient tradition and deep meaning. Tobias couldn't understand the language, but the tone was clearly respectful, even reverential. This wasn't a threat or a demand. It was something else entirely. Standing Bear stepped forward to serve as translator, his English halting but adequate for the occasion. "My father, Chief Red Hawk, speaks of great honor," the boy began. "He says you have shown courage that transcends the boundaries between our peoples. You risked your life to save a Lakota child, asking nothing in return. This is the behavior of a true warrior, regardless of the color of his skin." Red Hawk continued speaking, his words flowing like formal poetry, and Standing Bear struggled to convey their meaning. "My father says that among our people, such courage creates obligations that must be honored. You have saved the son of a chief, and the entire tribe stands in your debt. We have come to acknowledge this debt, and to offer our protection and friendship." Tobias was overwhelmed by the formal gravity of the situation. He had saved one boy from a cave-in, acting on instinct and basic human decency. He never imagined that this simple act would result in 500 warriors riding to his isolated cabin to offer their formal gratitude. Red Hawk gestured to the warriors behind him, and several dismounted to present gifts. There were buffalo robes, beaded clothing, weapons, and most significantly, a decorated war lance that marked Tobias as an honorary member of the tribe. Each gift was presented with formal ceremony, and Red Hawk explained the significance of each item through Standing Bear's translation. But the most important gift was intangible, the promise of protection and friendship. Red Hawk announced that Tobias McKenzie was now under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Any harm that came to him would be considered an attack on the tribe itself. He was welcome in any Lakota camp, would be fed and sheltered wherever he traveled in Lakota territory, and would be defended against any enemy as if he were Red Hawk's own son. For a man who had lived in isolation for 4 years, this offer of belonging was almost impossible to comprehend. Tobias had resigned himself to a life of solitude, convinced that his disability and his obsession with the mine had made him unsuitable for normal human community. Now he was being offered membership in one of the most proud and exclusive communities on the frontier. The ceremony concluded with Red Hawk placing his hand on Tobias's shoulder and speaking directly to him in English, words he had clearly been practicing for this moment. "You have shown that white man and red man can honor same values, courage, sacrifice, respect for life. These things matter more than color of skin or language we speak. You are brother to Lakota now." As the warriors prepared to leave, Standing Bear remained behind for a private conversation with Tobias. The boy explained that he had been visiting the mine secretly for weeks, fascinated by the white man's determination and courage. He had entered the tunnels out of curiosity, not understanding the dangers, and would have died if Tobias hadn't risked his own life for the rescue. "My father says you are true warrior," Standing Bear told Tobias. "Not because you fight, but because you choose to help when helping is dangerous. This is greatest courage, to do right thing when no one watching, when no reward expected." After the Lakota had departed, Tobias sat outside his cabin for hours, trying to process what had happened. The medicine pouch around his neck, the gifts piled in his cabin, and the memory of 500 warriors offering their friendship seemed like something from a dream. But the war lance planted in the ground outside his door was real enough, a visible symbol of his new status as an honorary member of the Lakota Nation. The practical implications of this relationship became clear over the following months. Lakota hunting parties would occasionally stop at Tobias's cabin, sharing news from across the territory and bringing gifts of food and supplies. When winter arrived, Red Hawk sent warriors to help Tobias prepare his cabin and mine for the harsh weather, ensuring that his disability wouldn't prevent him from surviving the cold months. More importantly, the Lakota presence provided protection that Tobias hadn't even realized he needed. Word spread throughout the territory that the crippled miner was under Chief Red Hawk's protection, and this knowledge deterred the kind of claim jumpers and troublemakers who might otherwise have seen Tobias as an easy target. But perhaps the most significant change was in Tobias himself. The isolation that had defined his life for 4 years was broken, replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose that had nothing to do with finding silver. He began to see his mine not just as a source of potential wealth, but as a meeting place where two cultures could come together in friendship and mutual respect. Standing Bear became a regular visitor, fascinated by the white man's mining techniques and eager to learn about the tools and methods used to extract silver from rock. Tobias, in turn, learned about Lakota customs, language, and the spiritual significance of the Black Hills to the tribal nation. These exchanges enriched both their lives, creating a friendship that bridged the vast cultural divide between their peoples. As word of the unusual alliance spread, other settlers began to view Tobias with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. Some praised him as a bridge between the races, a living example of how whites and Indians could coexist peacefully. Others worried that his friendship with the Lakota might encourage more tribal presence in the area, potentially threatening white settlements and mining claims. Tobias paid little attention to such criticism. His rescue of Standing Bear had been motivated by simple human decency, not political calculation, and the friendship that resulted felt natural and genuine. The Lakota had accepted him not despite his disability, but because of the character he had shown in the face of danger. This acceptance was more valuable than any amount of silver he might have found in his mine. The relationship between Tobias and the Lakota also had broader implications for the region. Chief Red Hawk's public declaration of friendship with a white man sent a powerful message to both communities that cooperation was possible, that individuals could rise above the prejudices and conflicts that divided their peoples. This example inspired other instances of cross-cultural cooperation and understanding. Local traders began to deal more fairly with Lakota customers, knowing that mistreatment might reach the ears of Tobias and through him, Chief Red Hawk. White settlers who encountered Lakota hunting parties were more likely to treat them with respect, understanding that the tribes had white allies who could verify their treatment. The climate of mutual suspicion and hostility that had characterized the region for years began to soften, replaced by cautious but growing trust. Tobias's mine, meanwhile, remained as elusive as ever. Despite continued digging and exploration, he never found the rich silver vein that had driven his father's dreams and sustained his own obsession for so many years. But this failure no longer felt like defeat. The mine had given him something more valuable than silver, the opportunity to prove his character when it mattered most, and through that proof the discovery of a community that valued him for who he was rather than what he could produce. In 1885, 3 years after the rescue, Tobias finally admitted that the mine would never be profitable. His savings were exhausted, his body was worn out from years of difficult work, and even his legendary stubbornness had its limits. But instead of leaving the area in defeat, he chose to stay and build a new kind of life. With help from his Lakota friends, Tobias converted his cabin into a trading post, serving both white settlers and tribal members who needed supplies or repairs. His reputation for fairness and honesty, established through his relationship with Chief Red Hawk, attracted customers from throughout the region. The business was modest but sustainable, providing enough income to support a comfortable life without the constant struggle and disappointment of mining. Standing Bear, now a young man, became Tobias's business partner and cultural interpreter, helping to facilitate trade between the communities and resolve the misunderstandings that inevitably arose when different cultures attempted to work together. Their partnership demonstrated that cooperation could be profitable as well as morally satisfying. The trading post also became a symbol of the new relationship between whites and Lakota in the Black Hills. It was a place where members of both communities could meet on neutral ground, where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, and where the next generation could learn that their father's conflicts were not inevitable or eternal. When Tobias McKenzie died peacefully in 1901, at the age of 71, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people from both communities. Chief Red Hawk, now an elderly man himself, delivered a eulogy in both Lakota and English, praising Tobias as a man who had proven that courage and compassion could bridge any divide. Standing Bear, now a respected leader in his own right, continued to operate the trading post according to the principles that Tobias had established. The business thrived for another generation, serving as a lasting monument to the friendship that had begun with one man's decision to enter a dangerous mine to save a boy he had never met. The medicine pouch that Standing Bear had given Tobias after the rescue was buried with him, along with the war lance that Chief Red Hawk had presented during that memorable ceremony. These symbols of cross-cultural friendship were Tobias's most treasured possessions, more valuable to him than any amount of silver could have been. Today, the site of Tobias McKenzie's mine and trading post is marked by a simple monument that tells the story of the rescue and the friendship that followed. Visitors can still see the entrance to the abandoned mine, now sealed for safety, and the foundation of the cabin where Tobias lived for over 20 years. But perhaps the most important legacy of Tobias McKenzie's story isn't found in any physical monument. It's found in the example he set of how individual actions can transcend the prejudices and conflicts of their time, how simple human decency can bridge the deepest cultural divides, and how sometimes the greatest treasures are discovered not in the depths of the earth, but in the depths of the human heart. The man who had spent years searching for silver in the darkness of a mountain ultimately found something far more valuable in the light of human friendship and mutual respect. His willingness to risk everything for a stranger proved that heroism doesn't require perfect health or ideal circumstances. Sometimes it only requires the courage to do what's right when doing what's right is difficult and dangerous. Tobias McKenzie never became rich, never found the silver that had driven his family's dreams for 30 years, and never overcame the physical limitations that resulted from his accident. But he became something more important than wealthy or healthy or successful. He became a bridge between two worlds, a living proof that understanding and friendship were possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. That may be the most important lesson of Tobias McKenzie's remarkable life, that our greatest disabilities can sometimes become our greatest strengths, that our most difficult circumstances can lead to our most meaningful achievements, and that the courage to help others when we ourselves are struggling is the truest measure of human character. The mountain that had taken his leg and his livelihood ultimately gave him something far more precious: the opportunity to prove that even a crippled miner could be a hero when heroism was needed, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not by the strongest or the fastest or the most fortunate, but by those who simply refuse to walk away when someone needs help.